A few years ago, my best friend and I got tickets to see a seance. It was going to be at an old theater in downtown Oshkosh, which is just plain scary for anyone who's listening from the area. And I was in it to win it. Fully hooked, line, and sunkered for an evening of contacting the unknown. I remember the auditorium being absolutely freezing, so we sat bundled up to our eyeballs in our coats. The fluorescent lights never dimmed. We and about 20 other audience members made unintentional and awkward eye contact with one another. Two men announced they were going to essentially shock and awe us with their talents of contacting the other side. They had a fun hipstery thing going on between them. One was a skeptic and one was a total believer, which is a crazy and totally original concept, if I have to say something. Sorry to disappoint, but I don't remember much of the performance itself. I did volunteer for one of the acts, though. I steeled myself, putting up every psychic block in place because I wasn't going to let this glorified hipster win tonight. I was asked to think of a number and write it down, something near impossible for the performer to guess. You can insert your own hokey joke here about make it your social security number. At the time, I was working at a historical park, and one of the locations was a military fort set in 1836. So that'd be the number I'd go with. I had to answer a series of yes and no questions about my personality, likes, and dislikes, and they read my mind and used crazy math calculations to jot down the number I chose onto a piece of paper in a manila envelope they held in their hands the entire time. The other volunteers had their numbers guessed within seconds, and I was the last holdout. There would be no way this dude could guess an incredibly random year. Well, fuck me and the high horse I rode in on, I guess, because he did. I can see myself in clear detail making the most intense eye contact with my best friend as my world seemingly melted around me. Clearly, I had been duped. They had to have watched my hand movements while writing the year out, or had a mirror installed above all of us, and a stagehand was reading off our numbers into a small earpiece. Right? Right. The guy autographed his correct guess, handed it back, and they expected me to go back to my normal day to day life and activities after all of that. I'm pretty sure at some point they explained how they did it, but all I could hear from then on out was static and a steadily increasing in volume and intensely constant scream. Hey there, I'm Megan, a freelance paranormal researcher and investigator of over 20 years, and welcome to Paranormal Potpourri, the show where we mix the ordinary with the extraordinary to uncover the strange, the mysterious, and the downright weird. The scent profile for today is durian and chocolate chip cookies. Let's take a deep breath and get into it. One of the main tenets of paranormal investigating is communication. Intelligent communication is like striking gold. Some spirits are eager to talk to you, jumping in during your conversations or questions. Others take a bit more time and effort to say what they really want to say. Most love eavesdropping and will give you the most responses when you're not looking for them. Usually it happens when we take breaks and just start talking casually. One of my favorite pieces of evidence is when I got corrected by a female spirit on how to say her name while we were all joking around on the stairs of a historical house. Were we asking questions to this particular spirit? No, not that I know of. But did she want to put her 2 cents in and make sure that we got that shit right? You betcha. Another pillar in the paranormal world is debunking, or at least trying to find a reasonable explanation for paranormal activity. The groaning you hear at night coming from the walls in your kitchen, that could just be your house settling on its foundation or adjusting from warmer to cooler weather, and the framing is contracting. causing the unnerving noises. The creepy feeling of being watched while you do laundry in the basement might be high spikes of EMF, which is electromagnetic frequencies, coming off of your exposed wiring, heating ducts, and furnace if you don't have a finished basement, or if you've got some older appliances. Not everything that goes bump in the night is ghost related. Some in the paranormal business make it their sole purpose to debunk and explain away possible activity, which ultimately helps the field continue to learn, grow, and adapt. So, to develop a method of communication and a stable working relationship with an entity or spirit is like having your imaginary friend come to life. And if you can replicate your communication methods multiple times and have a series of unique interactions, that's quite literally the dream of researchers and investigators everywhere. Imagine if you could take that on the road, being able to interact with not only your new stage show partner, but with spirits and entities that come with your audience members. And audience members could participate in your act by coming on stage and showing everyone that you're not fooling anyone. This shit is for real. Well, strangely enough, two sets of siblings were able to do that exact thing, and both met some, call it interesting roadblocks on their way to notoriety and near celebrity status. Let's travel back in time and place to Hydesville, New York around 1848 and meet Leah, Margaretta, or Maggie, and Catherine, Kate Fox. The two youngest Fox sisters, Maggie and Kate, still lived at home with their parents, John and Margaret, and oldest sister Leah was living in Rochester with her husband, Bowman Fish. When moving into the area years before, the neighbors all came round and seemed to mention the same strange thing, that the house they now lived in was haunted. A peddler passing through had been murdered by a man named Bell, and his body was buried deep down below the root cellar. Knowing that didn't seem to scare off the Fox family from their abode, and they continued to live there peacefully. Until one day. When Maggie and Kate were 14 and 11, they began to notice something unusual during their bedtime routines. They would hear a series of knocks and raps on the walls and furniture in their room. They started, obviously, questioning the noise and asking for it to respond in a certain way, like a knock once for yes, twice for no sort of thing. And whatever, responded with an otherworldly intelligence. And these conversations became a nightly thing for the sisters. Naturally, Maggie and Kate shared their new friend, freshly christened Mr. Splitfoot. What? Don't act like your childhood imaginary friend also didn't have a perfectly unnerving nickname. With their neighbor. The girls even asked their neighbor if they wanted to see a demonstration. Packed into their upstairs room, Maggie, Kate, their mother Margaret, and their neighbor waited for Mr. Splitfoot to start talking. Soon enough, they were getting raps and knocks answering their yes and no questions, and they were having Mr. Splitfoot count to certain numbers. Usually, when I was younger and would invite my neighbors over for an afternoon, it was like to play in my basement or chill out on my swing set, not to conduct a full out spirit communication session. What's the next interaction by the mailbox like after that? Do you still have to wave to one another as you bring out your trash cans? Do you become a Mrs. Kravitz and begin to watch your weird neighbor's every move from your front window? Honestly, I think the next block party is going to have some stilted conversations. Word spread quickly throughout the community of the Fox sisters' ability to communicate with the spirit world. The commotion forced the Fox parents to send Kate and Maggie to Leah and Bowman's home in Rochester for a time. With the girls gone, they had hoped that the craze would just calm itself down and fizzle on out. That thought was soon dashed when the knockings started up in the Fishes' home. Can I just say, what a kick-ass name Leah Fox Fish is. Like, Leah is truly underrated in this tale, and I just feel like she needs a moment in the spotlight for having my favorite historical name I've come across lately. Friends of the Fox family, Amy and Isaac Post, offered up a room to the girls in Rochester, hoping to give the family a break from the traveling Mr. Splitfoot shenanigans. The Posts were radical Quakers, which is an oxymoron, and used the notoriety of the sisters' so-called gifts to spread the word around their own community. This gift of hospitality would be the origin of the spiritualism movement within the United States. History nerd moment. This will be a way to show my parents that 4.5 years in college for a history degree wasn't a waste of time. The basis for the spiritualist movement in the early to mid 1800s was acknowledging the thinning of the veil between the living and the dead, that an individual's awareness or consciousness didn't diminish after death, and that they could still be contacted by the living. This awareness was heightened post mortem, and it could be called on to advise the living on moral and ethical issues that were presented to them, especially debates around the nature of God and or a higher power. Some in the movement even claimed to have spirit guides, which were specific spirits that they relied upon for information and spiritual direction. The spiritualist movement in the United States was one of the first nationwide groups to have women as prominent members and advocates for its social religious views. The leaders tied it in with the abolition of slavery and the women's suffrage movements that were just starting to take hold in the preteen years of the United States. This movement would hold the keys for mediums and spiritualists to start to take over the front pages of newspapers and begin their run in local theaters, auditoriums, and concert halls, all spreading the good word about contacting the other side. Oh my oh my god. When did all of these leather elbow patches appear on my shirt? Dude, why do I smell like old paper and ink all of a sudden? Is being a historian like being bitten by a werewolf, but instead of a lycanthrope, it's just Ken Burns? I'm already in a room with no windows. I can't tell if there's a full moon or not. Oh, oh no. Oh, I can feel it happening. The urge to actually and write short essays is so strong. Must fight temptation to listen to Hamilton with an analytical ear. Ah! November 11th, 1849 is the first documented public exhibition of the Fox sisters' skills. They demonstrated their abilities in front of a sold-out audience at Rochester's Corinthian Hall. This marks the start of Maggie and Kate's rather, let's say, illustrious careers as spirit mediums. They were known as the Spirit Knockers of Rochester. Maggie and Kate would perform hundreds of seances, being asked ridiculous questions like the nature of railroad routes, investment opportunities, and the ever so popular, do you know if the person I like likes me back? And even with all that nonsense, the sisters made an absolute killing as spiritual mediums. Their sister Leah even joining them after showcasing some talent in spirit communication. The Fox sisters were a household name in the 1850s, and it seemed like it was going to stay that way for quite some time. Well, sooner rather than later, critics and skeptics began voicing their concerns over the possibility of trickery and deception. What do you know? Haters gonna hate. Many began speculating that the sisters were using their bodies to produce the otherworldly noises. In 1851, one critic wrote after seeing the sisters perform that the sounds of cracking toe joints was so loud it could be heard echoing in a large hall. The University of Buffalo sent out a group of investigators that came up with a similar conclusion. The rapping and knocking noises sounded like the women popping joints in their body. The investigative team placed cushions under Maggie and Kate's feet, and weird, the raps and knocks just didn't happen. This is important to note. It was completely unheard of for women during this time period to show their ankles and calves to men that weren't their family or husbands. So it would have been a very easy and a very slick move on the Fox sisters' part to use their feet, ankles, and knees to make sounds because no one would be able to lift their skirts to check. The Boston Courier put up a $500 reward to any medium who could demonstrate paranormal activity in front of a committee. Maggie and Kate agreed to the challenge. Their demonstration was analyzed by a magician named John Wyman, and he declared that they had both failed, as he had observed the raps were coming from the movements of their foot bones. This would be the death knell for the spirit knockers of Rochester. Maggie openly swore off spiritualism after the death of her first husband. She had made him a deathbed promise to convert to Catholicism, and she was a woman of her word, damn it. The only knocks and raps coming from her skirts would be the creaks and cracks of her knees as they bent down on the pew kneelers, by God. In 1888, Maggie was paid $1,500 to publicly denounce spiritualism and, by association, her own sisters. Kate, on the other hand, or Foot, married a fellow spiritualist and cranked that shit up to fucking 11. She began to translate messages from spirit in astonishing new ways. She could communicate two messages simultaneously, writing one while speaking the other. If spirit moved her, she could write everything in reverse. Blank cards would suddenly appear full of words and phrases. Kate was a celebrity. Once the Civil War started and thousands of Americans turned to spiritualism to deal with their grief. How bad could spiritualism be if one Mrs. Mary Todd Lincoln used it? It's not like she was reportedly off her rocker at any point in time in her life. Later, Maggie would go on to publicly confess how she and Kate came up with their creative knocking and raps at their Hydesville home as children. They would tie a string to an apple, as one does, and move it up and down, bumping it across the floor, dropping it so it would make different types of noises. As the interest in their considerable skills grew, the sisters learned how to crack their knuckles and joints undetected to make sounds as well. This truth bomb set off rampant speculation among spiritualists around Maggie and subsequently her sisters as well. A spirit medium held a seance to discuss Maggie's reputation with the other side, again, as one does, and the spirit of a spiritualist newspaper publisher came through with a shockingly sympathetic opinion towards Maggie's actions. Others said that since she had failed as a medium, that these confessions were her obviously coming out as a spiritualist critic. A year later, Maggie miraculously recanted her confessions and criticisms based solely on the advice that she had received from her spirit guides. Is anyone else shocked by this development? Or did we all just collectively hear a paycheck being deposited directly into a certain Mrs. Margaretta Fox's bank account? Maggie would set off on a new career in the spiritualist field, working and writing under the pseudonym of Mrs. Spencer, and she would go on to reveal more trade secrets of so-called spirit communicators and tricksters. Maggie joined back up with her sister Kate in Europe, enjoying a romp through the English countryside before their deaths in 1892 and 1893. I alluded to another set of siblings that claimed to have mysterious abilities to work and communicate with spirits earlier. They shenan once, they'll shenan again. This may come as a shock to those who know me, but I had never heard of the Davenport brothers before I started my research for this episode. Hard to believe, since I commonly get referred to as the human equivalent of Google. Ira Erastus and William Henry Harrison Davenport. A mouthful. They may have worked the same East Coast tour circuit as the Fox sisters. It's kind of like when Sabrina Carpenter would open for Taylor Swift during the beginning of the Eras tour, and then she went off to start her short and sweet tour 3 months later. Family legend says that in 1854, they all seemingly witnessed Ira begin to levitate, but not end it. And by 1855, a spirit guide by the name of John King convinced Ira and William's father, a policeman in Buffalo, New York, to allow his boys to do public spirit communication performances. Their earliest shows revolved around your typical spirit raps and knocks. They then added musical instruments as audience grew. The instruments would play on command with no mortal hand controlling them, and on some rare occasions would fly around the room. They spent 10 years traveling around the US as vaudevillian magicians with their acclaimed box illusion, and eventually followed the wave of spiritualism to Europe. Their manager always seemed to assure the paying audience that the Davenport brothers worked only with spirit power and never with deception or trickery. I mean, who could argue with an endorsement like that one? Now, what exactly was the brothers' box illusion? Imagine you're one of the lucky ones that snagged a ticket to the Davenport's dark seance. You find your seat, you settle in, and your attention is drawn to what's on center stage. A large wooden box, roughly 6 feet tall, rests on 2-foot tall supports. Carved vines and fleur-de-lis decorate the top and sides. There are 3 doors built into the box. Either end has benches for the brothers to sit on, with each seat having 2 holes drilled into them. The middle door opens to reveal bells, horns, and other musical instruments. But what intrigues you most is the series of ropes that extend from this monstrous structure. You watch as the 2 Davenport brothers walk out onto stage and select a willing participant from the audience to assist them. They instruct the volunteer on how to secure their legs with the ropes. With feet extended, the ropes were looped just below the knees and then around the ankles. The remaining length of rope would be brought over to the other brother, and the process repeats. There's a set of smaller ropes coming from the benches, and you see that those would be used to tie their wrists, securing them to the 2 holes in the seats. The brothers struggle against their bindings uselessly, and they declare that they are unable to move, thanks to the audience member who sufficiently tied them up. The doors on either end would close, stowing the tied-up illusionists away. The middle door would be closed last and the stage lights dimmed. You squint, twisting and turning in your seat to get a glimpse of what's happening on stage. Gasps would ring out as pale, ghostly figures appear and dance in the darkness, and then the eerie sounds of bells and horns and instruments would echo throughout the auditorium. After what seemed like an eternity, the lights would rise again, the doors would open, revealing the Davenports in their original secured positions. "Impossible!" you shout, your voice joining hundreds of others in shock and amazement. "You have just witnessed spirits performing music right in front of your very eyes." The brothers are untied by the same audience member, take their well-deserved bows, and exit the stage. Now, did you just waste your imaginary money on the world's most impressive prank? Unfortunately, your scenario ended much more peacefully than some of the recorded performances the Davenports put on during their European tour before they were chased off the continent. Paris, 1865. A man notices during the performance that the ropes around them afterwards weren't the same ones from the beginning of the act. Audience members bum rush the stage, tearing the box to pieces to reveal that the Davenports had been untying and retying themselves back up with different ropes that were stowed inside, and there was a trap door that they used to access the musical instruments. The French police were dispatched to stop the riot, settling those in attendance down with the promise of a full ticketed refund. A gymnast by the name of John Hulley followed their act around England. He was selected to help demonstrate the power of the box by tying Ira and William up. Holly used a type of knot called a Tom's Fool knot to secure the brothers. This knot is notoriously well known for being ridiculously difficult to get undone. Halfway through the performance, Ira angrily announced from the box that the spirits were unable to undo the knots because they were bound too tightly and were incredibly uncomfortable. Ira also went on to say, as a way to cover their asses, that the spirits were unfamiliar with the type of knot that was used and they couldn't be of assistance to the brothers. So, no ghostly concert for those in attendance that night. Huh. Okay. So he just came out and said it. Just like that. Just from the box. Just fully admitted that the ghost couldn't. Okay. All right. Just like the Fox sisters were investigated, so were the Davenports. A group called the Ghost Club took it upon themselves to defraud the vaudevillian fraudsters and were able to recreate their box and act on their own without the aid of any type of spirit help. Many others were able to replicate the same ghostly performance, causing the Davenports' box illusion to essentially fade into oblivion. Many in the spiritualist movement were well aware that the Davenports were fraudsters and openly admitted such, and they just sort of let them drown in their choices. Friend and biographer Pascal Beverly Randolph stated once, "I believe the Davenport brothers are deadbeats. In other words, that they are skillful jugglers without the slightest real spiritual power about any of their performances." Randolph had been a die-hard supporter of Ira and William until he had read an expose on them that ultimately convinced him of their conman ways. Of all the names I'll be bringing up in this episode, these two were the last I expected to say at all. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, and master illusionist and escapologist Harry Houdini, would begin a very heated, very public debate over the legitimacy of the Davenports. Knowing that those two men interacted with one another is sort of like knowing that Martin Luther King Jr., Anne Frank, and Barbara Walters were all born in the same year. Like, what the fuck is that all about? They all live separately in my head in different categories. And not once did I expect any of them to know each other. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a well-known proponent of spiritualism and probably the biggest cheerleader of Ira and William's abilities at the time. He even went on record to attest to their otherworldly prowess. Harry Houdini, by the time he had set his sights on the brothers, was knee-deep in his endeavor to expose this thing they called spiritualism, wherein a medium intercommunicates with the dead, and that it is a fraud from start to finish. Houdini claimed to have spoken with Ira, and that Ira openly admitted to the fakery and even showed Houdini the trick to escaping the ropes, which left him very impressed. The trick? Simply tensing up while being bound to create slack. Once encased in the box, they would wriggle their arms and hands free. And when Houdini asked Ira about the musical instruments, allegedly the vaudevillian said, "Strange how people imagine things in the dark." So, how did the writer of the world's greatest detective and the world's greatest magician become the world's greatest enemies? At the beginning of it all, the two men were actually friendly with one another, until Sir ACD decided one day to come out and declare that Houdini was a, and I quote, powerful spiritualist medium, and that he performed many of his stunts by means of paranormal abilities. Conan Doyle would go on to claim that Houdini would use these powerful abilities to block the powers of the mediums that he was trying to expose. How did Harry Houdini take that? Sir Conan Doyle is sincere, but deluded. Houdini and Conan Doyle's spat is like Tesla versus Edison, but for magic nerds. Oddly enough, though, Thomas Edison did experiment with tools for spirit transmission, along with Alexander Graham Bell. And this is where Houdini would hit most of his roadblocks in the realms of science and religion. Whenever those two topics meet, expect a stalemate of epic proportions. There's no provable basis for spiritual or paranormal activity on either side of that coin. It's frustrating even now in 2025 to deal with the pushback from those communities. One can't be legitimized over the other, and most likely never will be in our lifetimes. One thing about Harry Houdini, his ultimate goal for his legacy wasn't being a master escapologist or master illusionist. It was leading the crusade against vaudeville acts that took advantage of the grieving. He's quoted as having more respect for a highway robber who at least has the courage to prey on victims out in the open. It was the distinct violation of trust that deeply bothered Houdini. People wanted to speak with their deceased loved ones and were getting the wool pulled over their eyes and their pocketbooks emptied by con men and women everywhere. Houdini famously would attend seances in disguise. Once the medium began their con, he would loudly declare them as frauds and expose them a la punked. He would even perform the tricks for the attendees to prove that there was no spirit involvement whatsoever. He routinely visited mediums and asked them to speak to his beloved mother, Cecilia Wise. He would call them out on their bullshit when Cecilia would call him Harry or Houdini or use English phrases. His mother only ever called him by his true name, Eric Wise, and she could only speak her native tongue of Hungarian. Houdini was a member of the Scientific American Committee that offered cash prizes to any medium who could successfully demonstrate psychic powers or supernatural abilities. In 1924, the cash prize was $2,500, which is a hell of a lot more than the measly $500 offered to the Fox sisters, and today that'd be roughly $46K. The Davenport brothers, much like their box illusion, faded into irrelevancy. William died of consumption while on tour in Sydney, Australia in 1877, and Ira died in New York in 1911. Because history is just one giant ass circle and it loves a good running theme, a modern day debunker arrived on the scene a few short years after Houdini's untimely demise. James Randi was a Canadian American stage magician, author, and scientific skeptic. He spent most of his life challenging paranormal and pseudo-scientific claims after, as a teenager, accidentally interrupting a sermon of a pastor that claimed to read minds. Randy stopped the performance and showed the parishioners how the trick was done and stuck around afterwards to show the police as well. His 4 hours spent in a jail cell inspired him to pursue a career as a scientific skeptic. Like the famous men before him, Randy found himself battling against another in the field of magic, Uri Geller. Uri Geller is an illusionist, magician, and self-proclaimed psychic who is best known for his ability to bend a spoon in half with his mind. Let's call Geller the modern Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, shall we? Geller openly accused Randy of being a fraud, and Randy replied, "Yes, indeed, I am a trickster. I am a cheat. I am a charlatan. That is what I do for a living. Everything I've done here tonight was by trickery." Geller yelled back, "That's not what I meant. You are a fraud because you're pretending to do these things through trickery, but you're actually using psychic powers and misleading us by not admitting it." Is anyone else experiencing just the strangest sensation of deja vu? Am I, am I smelling burnt toast? Why is the room tipping sideways like that? Randy would go on to be the co-founder of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry and the founder of the James Randi Educational Foundation. The JREF sponsors the $1 million Paranormal Challenge, which awards a contestant that sum of money if they could demonstrate evidence of any paranormal, supernatural, or occult power. Just imagine being the one person who accepted Scientific American's like dumb $2,500, not knowing the stacks that were coming in the near future. Unfortunately for participants, into what I assume was the utter glee of James Randi, no one, and I repeat, no one was able to pass the preliminary test, which had parameters set up by the participant and Randi himself. You were basically giving yourself a gimme win, and y'all still doinked it off the uprights. Probably the greatest lasting legacy of James Randi is the creation of the Pegasus Award. This is, or was, depending on the accuracy of my sources, an annual award that exposed parapsychological, paranormal, and psychic frauds. To win, you had to qualify in one of 4 categories, and the winners were announced on April Fool's Day. Category 1, the scientist who said or did the silliest thing related to parapsychology in the preceding 12 months. Category 2, the funding organization that supports the most useless parapsychology study during the year. Category 3, the media outlet that reported as fact the most outrageous paranormal claim. Category 4, the psychic performer who fools the greatest number of people with the least amount of effort in that 12-month period. And in 2005, a 5th category was added for the most persistent refusal to face reality. Here are some of my favorite winners of the Pegasus Awards in the past. 1979, Prentice Hall and American International Pictures for the Amityville Horror being labeled as, quote, a true story. 1981, Charles Tart won for discovering that the further in the future events are, the more difficult it is to predict them. Also in 1981, the Pentagon, who spent $6 million to determine whether or not burning a photograph of a Soviet missile would destroy the missile. 1996, Sheldon Neidl, who predicted the end of the world on December 17th, 1996, then had to explain that it happened, but we just weren't paying attention. 2006, Uri Geller. 2008, Colin A. Ross, one for claiming that he can shoot electromagnetic radiation from his eyeballs. 2009, the Oprah Winfrey Show. Also in 2009, Scientologists. I'd like to think that Harry Houdini and James Randi would have been the best of colleagues should they have had the opportunity to meet one another. Or maybe Houdini's claim of returning for a visit posthumously actually occurred, and Randi just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But Megan, you protest, it seems like we're nearing the end of the episode and my heaps haven't been jeebed once. The only thing that might have given me the frights during the night is when you mentioned that movie, The Amityville Horror. You know your mom can't stand references to Jody the Pig. And waking up at 3:15 a.m. to go to the bathroom just means you have to wait until 3:16 in case demons are waiting in the hallway to drag you to hell. Yeah, yes, yeah. Oh, calm down. I know. I have a special treat for you. Remember last episode when I said I thought Ed and Lorraine Warren were as full of as much shit as a shit spreader in an empty field? Take a looky-loo right over here. Look. I found one of their cases that's been factually debunked multiple times, yet no one really wants to accept the truth because of the Warrens' associations with it and its presence in the paranormal psyche. Can you figure out what it is yet? Do you need a hint? It's right on the tip of your tongue, isn't it? Maybe this will clue you in. On the night of November 23rd, 1973, 23-year-old Ronald Butch DeFeo shot and killed 6 of his family members in their home on 112 Ocean Avenue in Long Island, New York. DeFeo was later sentenced to 6 terms of 25 to life for second-degree murder. December 1975, George and Kathy Lutz move into 112 Ocean Avenue with their 3 kids and the family dog after finding the house for a complete steal of $80,000. It came fully furnished with the leftover furniture and decorations from the previous owners. It came with a heated swimming pool, a full basement, detached garage, and a freaking boathouse. Within 28 days, the Lutzes move out due to near constant paranormal phenomena that terrorize them. The Lutzes never go on to fully explain what happened to them on that final night. According to them, it was just too frightening to describe. Have you guessed what I'm talking about yet? Would it help to know that the area of Long Island where the house is located is called Amityville? Did you got ding, 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 we got ourselves a winner. The Amityville Horror House should actually be renamed the Amityville Hoax House because it's as fake as as fake as a fake haunting can be. What we know about the alleged haunting itself comes from the transcriptions of roughly 45 hours of recorded tapes that were sent to author Jay Anson by the Lutzes, and he never actually was able to speak to them in person about what they said on the tapes. His, let's call it artful transcription, went on to sell nearly 10 million copies, and the world got to read about George Lutz having just the worst time with sudden and explosive diarrhea, just like all the time, every day, all day. The worst. You think I'm joking about that? It's referenced on nearly every page in the book. You can't go 2 sentences without hearing about George fighting for his life on the porcelain throne. IBS ain't got nothing on George, that's for damn sure. The true Amityville horror story should be George's absolutely destroyed gastrointestinal system. After the book was published and the film released, those closest to the Lutzes and the house itself started to speak out about the sheer number of inaccuracies that were depicted. Fact checkers took into account how often it was mentioned that the police were called during their 28-day stay and double-checked with the local police records. There were no calls made to 112 Ocean Avenue by anyone. Even the neighbors reported their time in the house as being very quiet and incredibly uneventful. The bar that George frequents in the book, the aptly named Witch's Brew, doesn't exist. Locals laughed at fans who flocked to the town looking for it. The story and events differ with the various editions printed, so the facts become even more blurred with each batch sent out to bookstores. The Lutzes eventually sue Ronnie DeFeo's defense lawyer, claiming that their story being published caused them undue mental distress. The only reason they had any stress to begin with was because DeFeo's defense lawyer, William Weber, was out shopping publishers for the story of the trial, and DeFeo's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. This was the famous "the devil made me do it" defense. The Lutzes heard DeFeo's story and the connection to the house, and they reached out to the lawyer to share their weird feelings about being in the DeFeo's house. The judge in this case ultimately dismissed it after pointing out that the Lutzes admitted to making up their stories in their testimony. George Lutz went on record to state that the book is mostly true, and that all I know is what happened to me. William Weber, DeFeo's lawyer, went on to say, "We took real life incidents and transposed them. In other words, it was a hoax." What do we know that happened during those 28 days? Well, most of the major events were brainstormed and put together by the Lutzes and Weber during multiple, and I mean multiple, documented wine-fueled meetings. All versions of the Amityville horror story include a Catholic priest who comes to bless the home. It varies whether or not the priest senses a dark presence in the upstairs bedroom, or if he actually hears a deep voice telling him to get out. The abundance of flies, either dead in a room or in a massive swarm chasing him out, depends on who's telling the story. The weird shit that happens, like doors slamming at all odd hours, the house always being freezing cold, goo drops on the walls and in the carpet. They could be red, green, black, it all varies. Kathy Lutz herself turning into an old crone. The red-eyed demon pig Jody appearing in the bedroom window. That's all up for debate. The final night's events are laid out as Kathy somehow levitating off her bed, George seeing the lights flicker and hearing doors slam, and all of the kids claim they were unable to leave their rooms all night long. So how did they get out if they weren't? Never mind. You know what's scary is almost all of that? The idea of having to tell your wife that you can't afford next month's mortgage payments, so you come up with a plan together to abandon the house entirely and let the bank handle it. And you can conveniently tell everyone that shit's haunted for real for true over there. William Weber filled the gaps in the Lutz's story with information about the DeFeo family only he and Ronnie would know. Like the fact that the neighbor's cat would frequently peep in the windows so much that Ronnie actually mentioned it in his court testimony. "Well, hello to you too, Jody the pig. Welcome to the story." Or about the one time DeFeo's dad hit his mom while she held a large plate of spaghetti and the spaghetti sauce stained the walls the goo began to mysteriously drip down from the walls and ceilings, right, kids? Right. To add to the overall bullshit nature of the so-called Amityville horror house, the house itself has been bought and sold 4 times after the Lutzes abandoned. Left quickly to save their immortal souls. And not a single owner since has mentioned a word about any paranormal phenomena. The only issue they all seemed to have was dealing with the crazed fanboys that would chip off parts of the siding or steal shingles off the roof so they could have a piece of the haunted house. Ed and Lorraine Warren's connection to the house comes from a paranormal investigation in 1976, where they ultimately declared it haunted after a photo was developed in which a demonic boy could be seen on the staircase. They obviously determined this boy to be one of Ronnie DeFeo's victims, possibly 9-year-old John, and that due to the house's violent history, an evil supernatural entity had entered and began its reign of terror on the Lutzes. That photo has also been investigated and declared a fake, simply due to the sheer amount of people that were in the house at the time the Warrens were there, and the boy just so happens to be an investigator by the name of Paul Bartz, who was kneeling on the stairs and wearing glasses, so the camera flash reflection caused the white eye effect of the demon boy. And wouldn't you know, Ed Warren loved his fancy flash camera and would use it to document most of the cases they worked on. I think it's the ultimate job of investigators, researchers, and fans of the paranormal to not fall hook, line, and sinker for every single claim of supernatural powers or activity that we come across. I'll admit it. I love those 5 ghosts caught on camera YouTube clickbait videos, and I do spend a majority of my time trying to figure out how one could fake the activity with fancy editing skills or even basic prop work. Do I fall into the trap of believing over sensationalized activity? Is gullible written on your ceiling by chance? We all want to believe so hard in the unknown because it's a thrill for our little lizard brains to brush up against the possibility of something else being out there that others have witnessed and said it to be true as fuck, yo. Hashtag spooky, hashtag paranormal, hashtag followers is so tantalizingly tasty to everyone. Skeptic or not, we all just want proof of something. To sit and speculate what if breeds reimaginations of the truth and turns something simple into something complex and ultimately untrue. And for those of us that do claim to have abilities, we should be prepared to be open and honest about how we use them should we face any pushback. The thing to remember is to use our skills for the benefits of others, not for purely monetary value or purpose. It seems a bit too cliche to end on a quote by Harry Houdini, but I'm a sucker for shit like this. Just remember, folks, it takes a flimflammer to catch a flimflammer. Thanks for sticking around for this episode. If you like this and want to find out more about the paranormal world, please follow me at my page, Already Here Investigates, on Facebook, and join the Paranormal Potpourri podcast group for updates and general tomfoolery. I'm Megan, and thanks for joining me in the simmer pot of Paranormal Potpourri. Smell you later. Thanks to Riverside FM for the amazing recording and editing service that they provide that I was able to use to create this episode. And thanks to the artists on Pixabay for the use of their music as my intro, outro, and segue selections.